Morning. My name is Jeff Sharp. I'm the director of the Ohio State School of Environment and Natural Resources. Thank you for joining us today. We anticipate as the day progresses there'll be people joining us and leaving. So if you have to depart early, we ask that you do it quietly. The fall is a great time to be on our campus. I had a chance to bike in this morning, and it's just lovely coming down the Olentangy River Trail and seeing this sort of kind of the beginnings of fall. So hopefully you all are getting out and enjoying it. Also on campus, it comes alive this time of year with the students returning. We have a host of incoming freshmen coming into our school and Ohio State in general, and lots of graduate students. I wanted to share a little bit of our school. We have about 800 high-performing undergraduates and nearly 100 graduate-level students in our school. It's great that a number of them are here this morning. One of our goals with the Environmental Professionals Network in collaboration with Ohio Environmental Council is to connect people, and so we're delighted that so many students have chosen to join us, and hopefully if you have a student at your table, you've taken some time to say hello and introduce yourself. Some of them are sort of like scouting out for potential careers, so this is a great opportunity for them to learn more. Could the students in the room just please raise their hand? So there are a good number of them. If you're a professional, we ask that you take some time and visit with some of those folks and share your experience. Truly, it is our students who are shaping our present and our future, and we're excited that you're part of this very important conversation today about environmental justice and public interest law. I welcome the newcomers to the EPN. This is kind of a unique event for us that we're co-hosting the event, but I wanted to share with you a little bit about the EPN. It's an ongoing program that sort of connects professionals with various topical leaders throughout the year. You can, if this is your first time attending, if you want to learn more about the EPN, it's quick and easy to engage by signing up at our epn.osu.edu website. So you can also talk to Joe Campbell or Nicole Jackson or any of the folks out at the front tables to learn more about it. You can also learn about upcoming events at our website, and from those folks, I really want to bring your attention October 8th. We're going to have a session focused on water quality and nutrient management, featuring the 3 state agency directors, the big 3 we call them, Ohio EPA, ODNR, and Ohio Department of Agriculture, and that program will be moderated by the Dean of our College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences. We anticipate that being a great event and an opportunity to sort of really be exposed to some of the salient topical policy issues in that area. In November, we will turn our focus to wildlife conservation funding strategies and coalition building with presentations from Naomi Edelson with the National Wildlife Federation and Kendra Wecker, who's the director of the Ohio Division of Wildlife. So we anticipate that'll be a great program too. Before I turn to this morning's program, I do want to bring to your attention that we do try to be a zero-waste event. You will see at the receptacles here, there are signs clearly indicating, and we've improved the signage since last year, so hopefully you can sort of decipher it, but please, as you depart and dispose of your waste, that you be attentive to the different receptacles and what goes in what, and grab somebody that looks like they know what they're doing if you need some help, because many of you have been doing this for a while, and we appreciate your commitment to zero waste. Turning to this morning's program, we are so excited to work with the Ohio Environmental Council to co-host today's program. I want to give a big thank you to that team for working with the EPN and leading up to this event. We co-hosted an event in February with the OEC focused on diversity, inclusion, justice, and equity that introduced some important and challenging topics. We are glad that we are able to work together with them on this. Today, we expect to have another set of engaging presentations and conversations. To provide a more complete overview of today's conference, our group of co-hosts and sponsors, and to introduce Michael Charles, our first speaker, is Trent Dougherty, General Counsel for the Ohio Environmental Council. Trent has been with the OEC for over 15 years, representing the organization across all issues and regions of the state. Please join me in welcoming Trent.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank everybody here for being here. This is our second annual Ohio Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. We call it a law conference, but it's more than that. As you can see around you, it is designed to bring together lawyers, law students, undergrad students, academics, and advocates to share in this experience, because it does take all of us as we move forward. Again, just to thank EPN, Jeff, Joe, Nicole for partnering with OEC. We obviously feel that whenever OEC and EPN can partner, it's something special, and this is obviously no change to that. Also, thank a couple of people also from the OEC side that made this happen. As I said, this is designed so we have a big tent and you folks can not only just hear from us and from these great speakers, but also talk to each other. But if you only talk to two people, other than the people that you know, make sure it's one of these two people, that it's either Tamaliapo Mapande or Chris Taverner from our office. They're the ones that, along with EPN partners, put this together. And those two are going to be the face as we move into this next decade that are actually going to change Ohio for the better. It's going to benefit each and every one of you to talk to Chris and Tamaliapo. It's been a benefit to me, so make sure you do that. And also thank to the financial sponsors who helped bring some of these great speakers here today. Some of our great friends like Laura Curlis, David Lipstrew, OEC board member William Andre Gruber, and the environmental law societies of University of Toledo School of Law, Cleveland Marshall School of Law, and the OSU Morris School of Law. And we've chosen to focus this year on environmental justice, environmental injustice, environmental racism, and not only in this, our second conference, but it's going to be a piece of each and every one of the conferences moving forward. And this is done for, I think, very important reasons. Last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of OSU's College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences. This year, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Ohio Environmental Council. Next year, we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And over those 50 years, we have made a lot of progress. We have done so much to help the health, the conservation of our natural resources, our state's environment, and our planet's environment. We've made a lot of progress, but unfortunately, a lot of that progress has been on the backs of those less privileged. A lot of that progress in getting pollution out of communities has consolidated that pollution onto other communities. And as we enter this next decade, which is going to be probably the most consequential decade of any of our lives, at the end of that decade, depending on what we do, we will know whether our democracy has a chance, whether this republic has a chance, and most importantly, whether this planet has a chance. And it's based on the work that we do. And we need to make sure that everybody is part of that, and that everybody reaps the benefits, and that not some reap the benefits and others get the byproducts. That's why we're coming here today. That's why we put together the great slate that we have for this. It's going to be a good day. It's going to be a long day. But there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to learn about, and there's a lot for us to do. We're going to learn about the history of the injustices. We're going to learn about the current manifestations of those injustices. And hopefully, most importantly, we're going to learn and understand how together we can find those future opportunities. Because at the end of this decade, we may not have a 50-year look back in order to fix this. And so we need to start it, and we need to start it now, which is why I'm going to stop yapping. That was a joke. Must be a bit early in the morning. But I'm going to stop as the lawyers in this group and those law students that want to be lawyers. We can stand here and talk about ourselves all day. But I will now thankfully introduce our first speaker, Michael Charles. And he's going to share his important story and his narrative, one that we don't often hear in Ohio. I will obviously let him tell that story, but please let's welcome Michael Charles. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. As you mentioned, my name is Michael Charles. I come from the Navajo Nation, where our traditional land is from the southwest United States in the Four Corners region. And I just wanted to go ahead and open up this morning by introducing myself in my native tongue. So, Yate Abene, She'e Michael Charles Yaneshe, Bilagana Nishle Ashihi Bashis Chin, Bilagana Dashis Che, Nakai Dene Deshinali. So good morning, friends and family. I just introduced kind of where I'm coming from and who my family is and what makes me Navajo. And I introduced my clans, Shihi, which is the Salt people, and Nakai Dene, which is the Mexican Navajo. And I just want to start off by making it clear that today I don't really speak for anyone else. I'm not speaking on behalf of a global population of indigenous people. I'm not speaking on behalf of the entire Navajo Nation. I'm speaking on behalf of my own experience as an indigenous person and the ways that I've processed and learned from other indigenous peoples around me. And so just a quick background, I'm a PhD student here at OSU in the Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering Department. My research is around how we can incorporate nature and ecological models into process engineering using math and computer science to analyze and design systems which include both technology and ecology. And these systems can have a range of different sizes, from a single manufacturing plant to the design of the entire Ohio State campus, or to an entire supply chain. And outside of my research, I've also worked at the UN climate negotiations for the past 3 years, and I've worked with global youth climate movements and organizations, bringing in my perspective as an indigenous person and bringing in the ideas of indigenous rights and all the other issues. And I bring that to pretty much all the work that I do. And I'm also very passionate about bringing educational opportunities back to future Native college students to help increase our representation in academia, and specifically on my reservation. And this has included working with high school students, and high school counselors on the Navajo Nation, and to identify specific issues which impact our graduation rates, and organize them by short and long-term solutions to really see if we can create an action plan forward. So I'm just going to go ahead and start with this question of what does it mean to be indigenous, and kind of bring in some of these ideas just to make sure we're kind of starting from a similar page. And I think in the US, I think we're very familiar with the terms Native American, or we might have heard Indian, and globally we might be familiar with other specific tribes, and that could be, an example is when you're learning world history for the first time and you hear about Latin America or South America, 2 names might come to your head, which is Mayan or Inca. If you're thinking about the Pacific or watch a lot of rugby, you might know the Maori people. But I want to just start with this idea that there really is no universal definition for indigenous. And further, indigenous peoples were self-identified, and a lot of that comes from how we relate to our family, we relate to the land. And although there's no universal definition, we do have many shared common characteristics. And for example, most of us have our own indigenous languages. We have land that we connect to and we identify with, places where our stories come from, our cultures are based in. And many of our cultures and our languages are deeply tied to the way that we know and interact with the natural world around us. So in the US and in many other places as well, we have different levels of recognition. So whether that's federal, state, unrecognized. You might know here in Ohio there are no federally recognized tribes. And I do want to go ahead and take this time to recognize the land of the people that were displaced from here. And I'm not going to be able to list them all, but I know a lot of the schools are named after them, so the Miami, the Erie, the Illinois are some just to start with. And I wish I knew all of them by heart, but I do appreciate that they let me sit here and learn here on their land. But I think across the US and across global indigenous populations, what's important to remember is that we have so many differences, whether it's our requirements for citizenship, whether it's blood quantum, whether it's being on the land, whether our people have been the time of the first contact. So being native here in the US looks very different on the East Coast than it does on the West Coast. It really impacts the number of fluent speakers in that community. It also can be related to displacement or not displacement. So as Navajo people, we're fortunate to be on most of our own traditional sacred land where, as we just mentioned here in Ohio, many of them have been displaced to other places. So for me, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what it has meant in my life to be Navajo. And growing up, it meant living off the reservation. It meant that most of my culture was learned through my time visiting my family and my extended family that did live on the reservation. And it meant that it was learned in these different types of kind of vacation modes or trips. So I would go back and forth in between kind of learning my culture, my language, different parts about what it really meant to be Navajo, learning about Grandma's hogan, which is the picture there on the left, enjoying my auntie's cooking, learning words from the languages as I try to speak with my grandma. And that kind of would then shift when I would return back. I grew up and went to school in Colorado. And so as soon as I returned back, it kind of flipped off that cultural switch. And it looked a lot differently of what it meant to be Navajo. There it looked like writing a state report about Arizona, because that's where I was born. It looked about writing history papers about my great-uncle's service as a code talker in World War II. And that was mostly just because I could interview my dad. And asking questions about our culture, kind of only when I could think of the specific and the right questions to ask my father. And so really the active pursuit of learning my culture began when I was in college, and I had went to undergrad at Cornell in Ithaca, and there I was able to live in a native-themed program house on Cayuga territory. And that's where it really helped me understand what I should be asking my family about my culture, what I needed to know as a Navajo person in the 21st century, and what that looked like as a Navajo person in academia. And the larger that my network of natives around me kind of grew, the more I grew a determination to understand how my education could really serve my people. And I learned about the issues that were hitting close to home, and I spent more time with my family on the reservation and trying to understand what, I guess, more recalling of what it really meant to look like on a daily life, of what that looked like in our family. And the more I learned, the closer I felt to my community, and I began to feel kind of a transformation of my identity, one that wasn't just Navajo when I went back to the reservation to visit my family, and one that wasn't just Navajo when I took time to be in ceremony or smudge with our plant medicines, and one that wasn't just Navajo because I needed a free pass into the tribal park, such as Monument Valley there on the right. It was one that stuck with me every minute of every day, and that's just a little bit of insight to my story, and I wanted to just kind of bring that because I wanted to reflect that what it means to be Indigenous really looks different for every single person that does identify as Indigenous, and it can look very differently in each of our lives. And so, for example, some grow up in the culture since they were born, and they're in powwow regalia, winning the Little Tots contests, and some of my cousins live on the reservation, some don't. Some are fluent in our language, some aren't. Our Indigenous bodies, just as we show up, they might be dark-skinned, they might be light-skinned. Some know our songs and our prayers, and some are returning home and learning. And today we have a young generation with parents and grandparents who were not far removed from being beaten for practicing their culture or speaking their language. And this is really important to remember because some of these parents and their grandparents chose not to teach their kids the parts of their culture because from their experience it will keep them safe. And that's just something to think about for a moment. And what it means to be Indigenous is different for everybody, and it's important to understand that and know that Indigenous really is an umbrella term to capture some common experiences, but we also have our own separate cultures across tribes and nations. And this is going to kind of go into this next slide where I'll start with reading the slide, and that says that Indigenous peoples account for most of the world's cultural diversity. Throughout the world, there are approximately 370 million Indigenous peoples occupying 20% of the Earth's territory. It's also estimated that they represent as many as 5,000 different Indigenous cultures. The Indigenous peoples of the world, therefore, account for most of the world's cultural diversity, even though they constitute a numerical minority. And this is important to understand. So with 5,000 different Indigenous cultures, that really is bringing lots of different experiences to the table. And in the US, we have over 550 federally recognized tribal communities. And this data the quote that I just mentioned is coming from the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So let's talk about the United Nations real quick, and this will just be briefly because we'll come back into it later. But the UN has less than 200 countries that participate as party members, and that's less than the federally recognized Indigenous communities just in Alaska. So in the context of the UN, it's interesting because most of the times as Indigenous peoples, we're grouped into one voice or one constituency, and it really lacks that understanding of these 5,000 different cultures or all the different sovereignties that we have in our own nations. And we're grouped into that voice, and this points to the fact that really any conversation around diversity is incomplete without bringing in Indigenous voices to the table and including Indigenous peoples in the decision making. And that includes in academia, in business, and political representation. But further, I'm going to make this point as well, that traditional Indigenous territories, we encompass, as I mentioned, 20% of the world's land surface, but we also coincide with areas that hold 80% of the world's biodiversity. And this is coming from a report from the World Bank, but this is what it means to be ecological stewards. And this stems from our cultures and our relationships with the land. This stems from our identities, which are rooted in the land, our languages, which we've learned from growing up on the land. And this proves that we belong to have a strong voice, and not just participation, but leadership when it comes to conversations around environmentalism or climate change. And as the world is searching for solutions, this right here shows that we already have them. And it's not just a platform that we need to lead. It starts by having our rights protected. It starts by ensuring that we're able to keep our land and continue to be those stewards of the land. So I'm just going to also point out some of these current events that are happening, but the point is that Indigenous lands have been under attack since first contact and continuously through the history of colonization. And so I'm going to start with Standing Rock there on the left. Who knows what was happening in Standing Rock in 2016? All right, yeah, so it's quite a few of us in the room, and right now happening with the telescope in Mauna Kea. And in New Zealand, they're dealing with other issues in Ihumato, where they're dealing with different buildings coming up on the traditional Maori land. And so these issues are coming up because the ecological stewardship and the history of Indigenous peoples has preserved their land, and now it's making them targets for different issues, whether it's pipelines, a telescope, or housing developments. It's intruding onto their rights to protect their land, their rights to govern themselves, really, and it's coming with a lot of consequences, whether it's really, I guess, digging up a lot of the graves of their ancestors, which is a very visual thing that has been happening. But also just thinking about that, when it came to my work and kind of getting moved into this type of work, it was through sitting around and watching some of these things go down and understanding what is my role in protecting this. And I'll go a little bit more into that in a little bit later, but I want to think about real quick, together thinking about the relationship that the first Europeans had with the land when they came to what we know as the United States. And now think about the relationships that the Indigenous peoples or the Native Americans had with that same land. And as you kind of put that in your mind, I'm going to go ahead and read an excerpt from a book called Environmental Ethics for a Post-Colonial World, and that's this. So colonists used the doctrine of terra nullius, or vacant land, then to claim that the vast expanse of North America was there for the taking. It was not owned by anyone. In European terms, only work transformed wild nature into private property. To establish a moral and legal claim to ownership, a man had to alter the land. Agricultural gave the new Americans a moral claim to ownership of the land that had previously been occupied by Indians. 15,000 years of hunting and gathering provided no moral claim at all. And this kind of goes back to that idea of historical ecological stewardship really has put a target on our back, and that's because there still really does exist this difference in culture and difference in relationship with the land. And we can clearly see that these are still happening. Every single one of these has either happened in the last year or since 2016. But I just want you to think about that kind of target on the back that we now have as Indigenous peoples in our land. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what's at stake and talk mostly about just what are the impacts and the real impacts that Indigenous peoples are facing across the world when it comes to climate change. So last October, the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they released a report, and that showed the consequences of inevitable global warming and the drastic action needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement or the international agreement set by the UN framework on climate change. And the goal of that was to prohibit global warming from getting past 1.5 degrees Celsius. from pre-industrial levels. And this is a number that's important to remember because we'll come back to it. But with this and concern about reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius, headlines popped up all over social media, all over different news sources, and that was that we had 12 years to act. And I don't know if anyone saw those types of headlines, but that was a big kind of hype within the environmental and climate justice movement. And that really became a topic of conversation, and that spread all this panic and worry that the communities over these times in a potential future climate crisis would have to deal with 1.5 degrees Celsius. And however, many people didn't really understand how Indigenous people are impacted already. Right now, today, as we sit in Ohio talking in this room, and I'll kind of go into this, but first I'm going to kind of talk about what's at stake from an identity level, and that's that our Indigenous cultures have taught us that through our languages, our stories, and our practices, that our identity is tied to the land. So what happens to us when climate changes? Our identity is impacted. The ways that we know how to farm, fish, and hunt must also change. We must adapt. Our practices, our languages, and stories will also need to adapt to explain the new relationship or identity that we now experience through climate change. And so most of our Indigenous knowledge are from systems that are a result of our ancestors' collective experience over millennia, and they teach us how to survive and provide for our future generations. So what we're experiencing now is a rapid change in a climate that's unprecedented, and this impacts the way that our existing knowledge systems can accurately teach us about the world around us and the accuracy that we can connect then with our ancestors and the knowledge that they knew. And so we have Indigenous peoples all across the world from different regions, different ecosystems, and experiencing different impacts of climate change. And so I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about some of these impacts from different regions. And according to the World Wildlife Fund, their Arctic program, the average temperature of the Arctic right now has increased by 2.3 degrees Celsius since the 1970s. Now remember, we were just panicking about 1.5 degrees. And what happens in the Arctic is this impacts the livelihood and the safety of about 400,000 Indigenous peoples who live there, such as the Sami, the Inuit, the Nanette. And as the temperatures are warming, the ice is thinning, and this is causing displacement of the people from their homelands and displacement of the species that are fundamental to their diets and their economies. And it's increased the number of reported ice accidents resulting in injury and death. And so for Indigenous peoples in the Arctic, climate change is directly impacting them today, their safety, their economies, their cultural practices, and their Indigenous knowledge and identity. And the story doesn't stop here. As we know, everything is connected. So as the ice melts there, that's causing the sea levels to rise, and this is impacting Indigenous peoples who live on islands or coasts. And many people along the coastlines have to adapt as the sea levels rise and move further inland. Again, we're seeing that displacement. And to many Indigenous peoples, it's not just the land that's submerging, it's part of their identity. Remember, as we tie to our land, we're tying to our ancestors, we're tapping into the knowledge of our cultures. And so while some Indigenous peoples will worry about managing too much water, we also have on the other end of that many who will have to learn how to manage without. And that's coming from increased drought, and it's impacting us in Navajo Nation in the Southwest. And it's also impacting a lot of other tribes around Africa. And as water's becoming more scarce, our farming and our shepherding is being impacted, and that's a lot of the practices that make us Navajo. And along with that, we have wild horses still across our land, and as the water is, we're seeing that drought and the water lines are decreasing, where they're used to going to go drink water is now becoming swampy or muddy, and we've had a lot of cases where those wild horses are getting stuck in the mud, and then there's out and overheating or dying of starvation as they're stuck. And so it's really impacting the land around us and our cultural practices, but also it's impacting our economies and the way that we are used to living. And I also wanted to point out some of the other things that are happening specifically on Navajo Nation, since that's where I call home. But we also had the Gold King mine spill, and that was in 2015, and that's the water here on the right. And this was from an accident that happened from a mine upstream and was actually known about from the EPA before that it potentially could happen we were given no warning. But this leaked a bunch of different chemicals, including lead and arsenic, into our water supply, and it's still there. Many people still don't drink tap water from on our Navajo Nation, and that's just about the 50% who have access to tap water. And outside of just these environmental and natural concerns and all these things that are happening, we also have to think about what happens as the climate's changing. How are we going to react as a society and globally as a society? And this is where economics and politics start to play a big role. And those that are associated with climate change, they're heavily impacting Indigenous people because according to the World Bank Group, we already account for 15% of the extreme poor. And we already know that our relationships with a lot of our colonial nation states have often violated our human rights. We know that our treaties meant to recognize our sovereignty are frequently broken. And we recognize that in some places, like China right now, doesn't even recognize the term indigenous and kind of has this erasure built into their political system to begin with. And in Latin America, and we've seen all this news about the Amazon and the Amazon fires recently. We know that Indigenous people's land rights there their land rights and their safety are very much at risk from the exploitation of whether it's delogging in the Amazon or making room for agriculture. We know what's at risk there, and that's the Indigenous peoples, their bodies and their land. And the activists there that are, whether you call them activists or really they're just trying to protect their home, they have to fear for their lives in these areas, and the number of murders across Indigenous activists is rising. And in 2017, we saw over 200 environmentalists just killed. And so that's just a start to just say all of this is at stake. And what's at stake, as we see on the slide, is our survival, our livelihood. As I mentioned, that identity, the way that we connect with the land. And our land and our landscape, and again, kind of going into that economic and political realm, we have a lot to lose in terms of increasing poverty or lack of resources. And so I'm going to kind of go into a little bit about my story, about how I got into this type of work. And with all this at stake, I feel like I've constantly felt a lot of heaviness around the issue of climate change. And it's not an issue that we need to prepare for in the future. It's happening now. And what's already being experienced by Indigenous people is those who are trying to protect their land, our waters, our salmon, our air, our children. What's happening to these people will only intensify as time goes on. And I never really planned on coming into this work, but it was really when the camp at Standing Rock occurred in 2016 that I really felt helpless, kind of sitting behind an academic desk here while watching the videos and reading the stories of the Indigenous peoples being targeted by mercenaries and attack dogs and water cannons, and left in cages overnight in parking garages. There was a lot of this injustice that was happening, and at that moment, I didn't want to become an activist. I simply wanted to protect the land and the safety of my Indigenous relatives. So, as I mentioned, I do a lot of work at the UN, where I've worked on a lot of things, both within the negotiations, a lot outside. And there are many more unnamed examples of the impacts of climate change on Indigenous peoples, but there are even more examples of Indigenous resistance, resilience, and adaptation. And so we're often seen as victims in this discussion of climate change. And I know that probably sounds pretty hypocritical as I just talked about all these issues and that are impacting our people. But I do want to make sure I spend a lot of the rest of the time focusing on the power of our people as well. And we do have these solutions, as I mentioned before, and the solutions are embedded in our culture and our languages, our songs, our ceremonies, our spirituality. And so when I work at the UN, I work with lots of different groups, but specifically I work with the IIPFCC, which is the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. And we are the official UN constituency, and recently in 2018 actually have acquired our own facilitative working group between ourselves and national parties, which allows us to engage with the UN negotiations a bit closer. And so when we show up in a lot of different ways. We can show up in the negotiating room, We can be lobbying countries to include indigenous rights and protection of our land within the text of the Paris Agreement or the Paris Rulebook. We can be outside the negotiation room protesting a specific event or issue. We could be outside the entire venue in ceremony on a nearby lawn. And all of these are experiences that I've had there while working in different spots of these UN negotiations. And however, what we bring to the UN that no one else does is special. I've seen it change the entire track of negotiations, and it played a huge role in the operationalization of the Indigenous Peoples Platform, or the facilitative working group I just mentioned. So we bring what we bring that's special, that's so different than any other politician, any other country representative, is that we bring our stories, our songs, our prophecy, and our prayer. And this is truly powerful. And it was so powerful that last year in Poland, we saw that we kept getting asked to kind of open up other areas of the negotiation, not just the ones that were around our own platform. And so I guess what I'll talk about real quick is then what are we fighting for? And a lot of what we are showing up to the UN to fight for is first the protection of our human rights. And if you know things about some of the UN policy, you might have heard of UNDRIP, which happened in 2007, and this is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that was only a little over 10 years ago that the UN actually recognized our rights. And you might be surprised, you might not be surprised to hear that there were only 4 countries that voted against it. And we're in one of them. The other one is Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But that is something that has been adopted by the United Nations. And so what we're there to fight for is to really ask that really gets embedded into every part of the negotiations, not just indigenous rights, but when we're talking about climate change, to make sure that those rights are still there in the text, so that when we're looking at solutions, whether it's technical or ecological, as we're looking at how land will be changed or even carbon markets, we want to make sure that we still have the rights to our own land and the ability to honor that sovereignty. And the other thing I mentioned is we talked about how many federally recognized nations there are in the U.S. So in the U.S., that is, most of our treaties do acknowledge our sovereignty as independent nations. So and on the Navajo Nation, we have our own government, we have our own EPA, our own Department of Transportation, our own president, our own elections. But there really is no honoring of this sovereignty once we get to the international level. And what we're really looking for and fighting for is representation and participation in these negotiations and in the policy that comes out of it, because it's impacting us the hardest. And just recently, we've seen some native nations, so the Sami up in the Arctic, they have their own parliament, and they're starting to get their own international relations departments, and that's something that's new and I haven't even heard of for indigenous nations. So there's progress, and we're seeing some of these things happen. And it's really cool to see and be a part of firsthand. But the other thing is then the integration engagement of traditional ecological knowledge. And so this is just, as we are speaking on climate change and the negotiations, and we're trying to figure out how do we take science and balance this in from these reports, and how do we take that and inform our policy decisions, what we're asking for is to also consider the ecological knowledge that we bring as traditional and indigenous peoples. And we're not asking for that to be second to science or academia. We're asking them to supplement each other. And I'll actually talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. But that is what we're fighting for. And in the end of it, we're really fighting for all of our relatives here across Mother Earth, whether it's indigenous, non-indigenous, human, other types of life. That's really who we're there representing, because it's the voices that aren't heard that are really the ones impacted. And so I wanted to make sure that I also introduce the work that I've seen over the last 3 years, that I honor all the energy and work that was brought by the indigenous peoples before me, who have been working for the past 25 years at the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. And I also want to acknowledge those that have been there since the first UN climate negotiations. I want to honor those who worked on seeing UNDRIP come to fruition. And I want to thank those who have been working at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues since that started in 2000 to ensure that our human rights are protected. And I also wanted to take this time real quickly to introduce you to a new project I'm working on. And this is a vision that I've had for the past year or so that, well, really the last 2-3 years as I've been working here and seeing that not only do we struggle having Indigenous representation, we're really struggling bringing in Indigenous youth and the young people's representation into the UN. And so the vision that we have this year is that we'll be, this year to COP25, which is the UN negotiations that will be in Santiago, Chile. I have the honor of co-leading, to my knowledge, the first U.S. Indigenous youth delegation. So I'll be going back to those negotiations, and our goals there are to continue the work that I've described in bringing the prayer, the storytelling, and the ceremony to the UN, and to the UN political world, but we're also engaging a global network to build power and momentum in climate action in general, and ensure that Indigenous rights and leadership are at the forefront of the climate justice movement. So that's something I'm really looking forward to, and yeah, just can't wait to see how that turns out. But moving forward, I mentioned I do work in the chemical and biomolecular engineering department here, so I want to discuss a little bit about how my role as a scientist has influenced my work in policy and vice versa. And I think it can be very frustrating to watch the political process engage with scientific research, and it can also be really frustrating how the peer review process can prevent research from being as reactive as it needs to be and current to the urgent political needs. And further, there are very few formal adoptions or recognitions of the reports that are given to the UN negotiations meant to advise their policymakers. And these are the reports coming from the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And a lot of these are just kind of written and then looked at, ignored, might come back into the negotiations, might not. And there are good examples out there how science has supported policy, but within climate change issues, sometimes it seems that the results are either hard to swallow or just ignored because the policy recommendations seem too challenging or maybe far-fetched. And so I often ask myself, what's the right way to engage? Is it to just put my head down and focus on my research and publish all the papers I can? Or do I sit inside the negotiations and just sit in frustration of the slow-moving bureaucratic processes that are debating an international crisis? And I feel like for me, I've found that my answer really is both. And I think that it's important to work in both areas because neither has proper representation of natives or indigenous peoples to begin with. And working on both sides of that interface really informs my work across that. So it improves my work as a researcher, and it improves my ability to communicate what can really impact the climate negotiations. So it can both help my ability to communicate what work we've already done, but it can also really inform the next directions we take with research. And I think that's really important to know. And it's another part I'm going to bring into this is another dimension into this question, and that is the dimension of cultural knowledge or traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, or as I had on the last slide, traditional ecological knowledge as it's formally recognized at the UN. And that's how does my indigeneity and the knowledge that I've learned from my culture contribute to my work across these areas in both science or in politics? And that question kind of always sits in my head, and I feel like I'll always keep searching for a better answer. But it's important for both academia and policy to understand the value of indigenous knowledge and all that it has done to protect the generations of our people and ensure our survival, because it should not be considered, as I mentioned before, second to academia or the scientific reports that are coming out regarding climate change, but both need to be considered supplementary to each other and actively inform each other to seek a truth that can really be shared and understood by everyone. And I think this is a truth that moves towards real climate solutions and restores our relationships back with Mother Earth. And finally, I feel like I really can't talk about kind of the difference between Western education and indigenous peoples without really acknowledging and recognizing the history of how these institutions have really impacted a lot of our cultures. And here in the US and Canada and really across North America, we saw the action of Indian boarding schools or other institutions that were very similar that really plagued this world. And those were operated with a motto that was kill the Indian and save the man. And these were meant to basically strip us of our culture and turn us into colonized people that could then live in a way without our culture. And that really caused a lot of hurt and trauma, as you can have guessed, But I also think it's really important to remember that it wasn't that long ago. In my family, it was my grandparents, and it was where our name Charles was actually given to our family. And here in North America, we're still healing from these institutions, and it will really play a factor in the way that Native scholars can lead the way to truly understand how academia and this traditional ecological knowledge can supplement each other and inform our policies and our discoveries in a way that honors our work in the present, but also the work of our ancestors in the past. So, as I begin to wrap up, I believe I'm getting close to there. I did want to share a bit of a prophecy that comes from Crazy Horse that I've thought a lot about in my lifetime, and I really do find it as a source of inspiration for myself, and that's this, that upon suffering beyond suffering, the red nation shall rise again, and it shall be a blessing for a sick world, a world filled with broken promises, selfishness, and separations, a world longing for light again. I see a time of 7 generations when all the colors of mankind will gather under the sacred tree of life, and the whole earth will become one circle again. And I think this is really important because I think, especially as Native people, and what I mentioned, and we don't want to just be seen as victims. We have solutions. We have spirit. We have pride, and I think this comes back to this idea that there is always going to be hope for us, of we do have the strength. And I think that doesn't just sit within our Indigenous communities, but as we sit and we're trying to solve this international crisis in a way that's just and equitable, as we're all trying to solve right here, I think it's important to realize this, that circle will become whole with all of us again. And this isn't the only prophecy like it. One that really sticks out to my mind is this past summer I was working on a specific policy of conflict of interest at the intersessionals in Bonn, Germany. And we had a meeting with the Secretariat, and we were supposed to kind of say, does this deserve to still be talked about? Should we wipe this off the agenda? Because there was a lot of lobbying pressure from fossil fuel industries to kind of not have a conflict of interest policy for reasons that are probably easy to understand. But the prophecy, I felt uncomfortable going in the room by myself without at least an elder or someone to really back up what I was saying, because I was the only one really from the group following this issue. And so I asked an elder from the Dene Nation up in Canada. They're actually related to us as Dene down in the Southwest, and we have a very similar language. But he went ahead and joined me, and the prophecy that he told was about how they were told since they were really young that there would be two main contacts with the white man, as he said, but it could be kind of thought of any Indigenous or non-Indigenous, the way that we're connecting. But he said the first time they'll come and they'll be looking for 2 things, and that's oil and gold. And they will come and they will take it from us, and it's going to happen. And they've been told this before even their first contact ever happened. And then they'll be back a second time. But this time, they'll be looking for food and water. And I think that's really important. We will give it to them. That's part of that prophecy as well. I think it's important to realize that even though there is a lot of hurt and healing that's happening in a lot of these Indigenous communities, there is still a spirit there that's ready to help. It's here and it's asking to lead. And I think that's really important as we think about how do we move forward, how do we engage all the communities in the room, and being conscious about what we're giving voice to. And so I do thank everyone here for allowing me to speak on behalf of myself and my experience as an Indigenous person, but also to kind of represent that sort of perspective here in this Ohio Public Interest and Environmental Law Conference. But I do want to leave with 2 specific words that you can kind of conclude with around this climate crisis, and those words are urgency and hope. And I think the urgency really comes from the need that we must act, and we must act urgently, and not pretend like climate change is a thing of the future. And from what I shared today, and how you can really help, and a very simple way to act now is just bringing attention to Indigenous issues. Remember that we hold 80% of the globe's biodiversity. So in regards to climate change and a lot of our environmental issues, the easiest solution is just to preserve and protect Indigenous people's sovereignty and our rights to the land. And further, we can also just be finding different ways to spark change. I talked about how in my life that looks sometimes in science, sometimes in policy, sometimes in just trying to change a system and work in education and all these other issues, and really bring opportunities to the next generation of Native leaders. But there are lots of ways that we can spark change. And I think that can start with whether it's practicing your science, doing your degree here if you're a student, having a conversation with someone who disagrees with you, signing a contract to switch your electricity to renewables, or go support the Ohio youth strike that's happening next week. Talk to a senator, talk to your grandma, take shorter showers, post on your Facebook, pass on the clothes in your closet if that are all still good, and share what you learn with your spouse. I think these are all just like very small things we can do, but as these become habitual, we do build our own power and kind of tap into all of this other movement that's happening around environmental justice. And once we have that power, then we can think about pressing for more systemic change and thinking about how we can change the consumerism culture and creating bold and direct actions that really involve the entire community. And so I'm going to then finish up with hope, because I do believe that although there's a crisis, and I do just mention all the urgency and all these things that we probably need to be doing, there's also hope. We do have each other, and there's really a beauty of community, and that beauty is that we don't have to do life alone, and we don't have to do this work alone. Despite all the sad and depressing news and reports that we hear about climate change, we still see young people, old people, any age in between. They're showing up to do what is necessary to provide a healthy future for the next generations. We mentioned all the action that's been happening over the last 50 years here in Ohio. That's happening globally. People are energized. They're ready for a movement, and they're ready to really tackle this issue of climate change. And now we just have to get everyone on board in between those gaps of people. And so I really find that is inspiring. And we should really be feeding off that energy and the energy of action and community to really focus on hope, because we really need to believe that we can create the future that we need. And so I'm going ahead and conclude with one final statement, and this is the same statement that I delivered to the closing of the 2018 climate negotiations, and that's this: that the resilience of my people has enabled my existence. So listen to Indigenous people's voices and humbly accept our wisdom and our knowledge as solutions moving forward, so it can also enable yours. And thank you. I think we go to questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
We have plenty of time for questions, so please just raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll bring a microphone to you. Okay.
Hi there, my name is Dominic Strackberdine. I'm a graduate of George Mason University with a degree in environmental policy. And I attended some seminars at George Mason on environmental justice and indigenous cultures. And that was with a member of the Inuit tribe up in northern Canada. And so I'm wondering, have you as a member of the Navajo Nation considered working with the Navajo tribe to partner with other indigenous peoples to address environmental issues globally, as the Inuit people are actively working to address climate change to preserve their cultures up in the Arctic?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. And I think that is actively happening. You can see, well, in case you didn't know, the biggest gathering of indigenous nations that's happened since, and in hundreds of years, was at Standing Rock. And that was where a lot of people really started to come together, not just as people and societies, but a lot of our leaders then started to talk a bit more. There's already work done in Washington every year through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where we have a lot of our own nations have our own embassies, actually. So we have a Navajo Nation embassy in DC, and we're working with other tribes in our leadership capacity, in our tribal leadership capacity. But I think what we also see that's different in the Arctic too, that we're trying to build, I think, here in the US, is that they have a lot of these circles of Arctic leadership, not just for their leaders, but they have them for their youth. They have an Arctic Youth Ambassador program that I know about. They have this whole Arctic Youth Network of their young and active people that are bringing a lot of energy to these issues to really have a space to come together, talk about this, figure out how do we do this just as Indigenous people protecting our land from a larger group and not just the tribal leaders. And I think here in the U.S. we're seeing that grow a lot, and I think Standing Rock did spark a giant energy in Indigenous, specifically the youth, this over the last few years, and I think we see it across a lot of the tribal leaders as well. Sometimes it's hard to really engage the tribal leaders and the presidencies or however it's set up, just because of the different things that we have going on. Sometimes it feels like climate change is super urgent until like you want to then talk about that in policy and try to figure out what do we deal with that, or we deal with a lot more issues of, like I said, it's impacting us now, but there's also other things impacting us that we're still trying to get moving on the ground, whether it's even just things as simple as electricity and water. So sometimes it does feel to get a little bit of a back seat in those movements when we're working within the tribal leadership. But I do think those conversations are happening. I don't think, as far as I know, we've never had a formal delegation from a tribal community show up, especially within like international negotiations. But we do have a few specific chiefs that do show up. And there's only 2 right now that I know of that have been showing up very consistently for at least for North America, and that's the Mohawk chief, Howard Thompson, and then, as I mentioned, Chief Francois from the Dene people. But yeah, I think that movement's starting to build a lot. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. I'm Yolanda.
Hello.
Great presentation. So you mentioned something very profound. You said that we can't have conversations about the environment without Indigenous people being at the table. So since this is a day of reflection, brainstorming, and in a sense mobilizing, what are some ways that non-Indigenous people in the room can better engage the Indigenous community to make sure that these conversations are inclusive by bringing Indigenous people to the table?
It's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, I think I don't always know the context really in Ohio because it's so different here of coming. It's probably the place I've lived that's had the least Native people, Indigenous people around me. But I think there are ways to like actively kind of reach out for those voices, or even just if they don't have time, try to get down a little bit of perspective, or even take words that you've heard like from here and just try to put that in the room, or even acknowledging that they're not there, just to make sure that whatever you're talking about might have a little bit of void in it and can be, it's not final, but can be reconstructed if needed to fit the needs or perspectives of Indigenous peoples. So I think it's just kind of actively trying to reach out to those communities and make sure that there are people there. I know that's not always possible, and I think it's mostly just that consciousness of just understanding who's not there and understanding whatever conversations you have may be incomplete because of it. Other than that, just trying to take everything. I think I mentioned when I first started that like a lot of what I know of what it means to be Indigenous is a accumulation of all the experiences I've had with not just my own family, but Indigenous peoples around the world, and every relationship kind of builds into my identity. I think it's still possible as people, when we're trying to bring in those perspectives and to think about that, to at least kind of go back through those cumulative maybe relationships, conversations, or things you've heard, to at least try to bring it to the room, not as from your perspective as an Indigenous person, but just as a perspective that may exist, and hold room for that, and then maybe have time to confirm that with someone else later. That seems to be the initial thoughts that come to my head. Does that seem to answer your question?
Thank you. I mentioned that because in my role in working closely with the national parks, we've reached out to some nonprofits for Indigenous groups. We have the Lake Erie Native Council, and just sort of identifying, like you said, understanding the culture, the eldership, how the structure operates within Indigenous communities, but making sure that we're like intentional about bringing those voices to the table.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, you can't really talk about the history of Ohio
Gotcha. Real quick, I'll just say, I think there's never a harm in just trying to reach out and ask, like, what is the best way. So if you're looking to work with a specific community and you can find some point of contact, whether it's through a web page or through their like tribal government or something like that, and you can find one name, it's never really going to be wrong to just ask, what's the best way to reach out? Is there someone I should be talking to? And hopefully they have someone who has the time to kind of respond to that. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was fantastic. My name's Kim, and I have a question. It's more of an imagination exercise.
Perfect.
It occurred to me that Ohio is chock full of universities and colleges, lots. What if everyone sitting here was a university or college president? What would you say? What would you tell them to do? How would you want them to work together here in Ohio?
Gotcha. This will be fun. I think where I've started is just as I mentioned, there is a lot of displacement from Ohio. We have no federally recognized tribes, so if we're all presidents of universities that are actively trying to figure out how do we include Indigenous issues, Indigenous voices into our academia, into our studies, it's going to take a lot of actual effort to be out into different communities, because there's a lot of this displacement. That means then we have to go and as university officials to go out to those communities and reach out, recruit, ask what they need once they get there. And once we find out some best practices in recruitment and we start being able to get people into the doors of our institutions, then it's just as important to figure out how do we help them stay here and succeed. I think what I know is, at least just some of the things that I've heard from some of the people that work in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion here is that we've had people in the past that have been designated just to go out to the different reservations and communities to bring in, to talk about Ohio State and bring in those people. I don't think those positions exist anymore, but I think there was also a struggle of like, okay, we get them in the door, now what services do we need for them that could be different than any other student here? And it's really hard to have that conversation without really recognizing within our diversity programs really what are the needs of students, Indigenous students, especially all the differences that I named, coming from the res, not coming from the res. Their home might have had running water and electricity. They might not have. They might speak a different language as their first language. They might not. And so trying to have real intention and understanding what that looks like for a student group and how to build a community there and figure out what those needs are, I think is really important. So I would say, yeah, a lot of active recruitment and showing up on their land as recruiters or as people representing the university and really sitting down and asking, once we can get them in the door, if that's an opportunity they want to take, how do we support you to succeed?
Hi, I'm Casimir. I'm an ecology student, but I spent the last year of my life in northern Minnesota fighting a tar sands pipeline going through there, Enbridge's Line 3. I'm just curious if your work at the UN is becoming harder over time with the political climate changing, specifically like in reference to ending resource colonialism at an international level, just because the political climate is getting a lot different maybe since it was in 2007 and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in some ways it gets a little more difficult. In some ways it gets a lot easier. and one way just specifically is showing up as from the U.S., but not being affiliated with the U.S. negotiation team. It looks a lot different because I think we then have a lot of power to kind of ask for some accountability from our own party, and also kind of recognize the ridiculousness when there's zero budge on their climate contributions, or whether it's the funding, or whether it's just even being the only country not signed on to the Paris Agreement right now. You can kind of show up, and it's pretty easy to kind of show up and say how much of a gap there is. Like, we are not showing up well as an international partner, so here we are as youth, and this is what we see in our own communities. We're calling for our own country to act, and that helps us, I think, too, even work within solidarity of a global movement of we're just as much from other youth that might be mad or upset with the U.S. in the negotiations. we can also be upset. We don't have to sit and think our country is right about everything. I think that kind of gives us some of that power and liberation of showing up as individuals, especially as Indigenous people. We can show up with a bit different sovereignty of, I'm a dual citizen. Do I show up on behalf of Navajo Nation, the U.S., both? Have a little bit of power there to pick and choose and figure out accountabilities, and I vote in these elections, so there is some accountability in the democracy of what my voice is saying, so that gives me the right to actually say it. So I think it's both helped and hurt, but I think the other thing too is you mentioned kind of like the Line 3 pipeline, the fights there. I think we've seen a lot more people that are willing to be more radical. I don't know if radical is the word, but they're just really to be there physically. I'm here and this is important to me, and I think that says something to begin with. And we get a lot of the people who are fighting those pipelines who show up now to the UN and understand that this issue isn't just between my home state and a company or this land and a company, but it's coming down to there's so much more that allows that to happen from a higher level of the system, that I think people are willing to kind of bring that energy and passion, whether, like I said, whether the word's radical or just showing up. I think we're seeing people show up now. Oh, sorry, there's one with a mic there. Sorry, I pointed right over you.
My name is Candace Brothers. I work with a renewable energy company here in Columbus, and I was just wondering, from a business perspective, if you have any ideas on how the renewable energy industry can make itself more accessible, especially to people who are in areas with limited access to electricity or other resources.
Yeah, I think the accessibility of renewables, I think it's a huge opportunity to work specifically with a lot of the tribal communities that might be off-grid to begin with. And I think at least what I've seen back home at Navajo Nation is we've found some companies in Utah are doing exactly that. They're bringing in Native people onto their staff. They're trying to figure out how do we work with these people. They're doing a lot of like trials and figuring out, like, will this work on these homes? And I think renewable systems, when we talk, like, a lot of people, like, the negatives are like the intermittency. We don't know when there's going to be power, when there's not. That's always going to be improvement for people who had nothing beforehand. So I think it could be almost a target community to really partner with. And I think the accessibility, especially based in Ohio, it will take going out onto the different lands of these people to really show what you can offer, to figure out and have that conversation. What do you need? Here's what we have. How can we make this work for both of us? And I think just Ohio is an interesting place, and I don't have a lot of experience living here, but I think it's going to take to really involve Indigenous communities a lot of trying to rewind some of that displacement and understand what does it look like to either reach out to them there or invite them back to other ways to access this land here. So.
Hello, my name is Robert Vertrees. I was on the faculty of the School of Environment and Natural Resources. And I have 2 points I think are very applicable. The first is a legal point. Out west, the federal lands, which are a big part of the West, and Indian reservations, the Supreme Court decided that first in time, first in right, they have reserved water rights. And when you're getting the Colorado Basin together, it isn't just the agricultural, industrial, municipal uses. You have a seat at the table, and I think that's very important. Secondly, and we're in the East here, we're used to riparian ownership, not first in time, first in right, those who own near their waters. Secondly, I'm in several environmental organizations like 350.org, and I can't remember exactly which ones of those cooperated with the indigenous peoples in the Standing Rock, or whatever it was, the pipeline, and they still do. And so I think that needs to be pointed out. One point was legal. Another point was that we have many interest groups that are already working with you folks. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Can you comment on that? Sure, yeah. I think when it comes to kind of the legal representation out west, it looks a lot different than out east. We have a lot more, we do have a lot more land rights legally. I think there's also something to be said too about the difference of what was taken to, so at least from my perspective on Navajo Nation, we have a lot of our own land rights, and when we've had our biggest generating station or the uranium mines that have, the coal mines and uranium mines that really have employed a lot of our people, it might not have been an informed decision, but one out of need and need for survival. So I think there's a lot of times to think about, yes, we had legal right. Sometimes we came from a situation that really gave us no other choice but then to agree to things. But I think that it's a fair point, that we do have a lot of representation within our own land, and that's when treaties are recognized and that sovereignty is recognized. I don't think it always happens for every tribe. We're lucky that we're one of the biggest as Navajo people. I think it looks a lot different on other lands, and there's a lot of, I think legally there's also just like no one, like besides Native lawyers, there's not very many lawyers that are going out and studying Indian law. So legally we don't have a lot of our own people representing us, so there's always a lot of miscommunication, there's a lot of misunderstanding. When you think about even our Supreme Court, there's very few people who, none of them really have a background in Indian law, so when Indian cases come up, it's either hit or miss. We're either going to see someone step up for us, maybe not. And in a lot of cases, we've seen more court cases go against our treaties than we have seen going for us at our Supreme Court level. But I think that's also changing in terms of how do we understand the legal system better as our own people and can increase our ability to really use that sovereignty, I think. But I think you're right in that, pointing out that there is that. When it comes to the organizations, I think a lot of these organizations are starting to really improve, and a lot of those improvements have been pretty recent too, and especially when working with Indigenous peoples. I have friends that work at 350 that are Indigenous. I know people that are kind of getting recruited into these different areas now a lot more than we have been. I also know that some of these organizations have structures where it's really hard for them to show up and actually bring in their Indigenous culture or be Indigenous in their organization. I've heard a lot of issues with a lot of these organizations doing a lot of tokenizing work of saying, all right, here you go be Native here because it looks good in our forefront, but not really giving them much voice to either change or direct what's going on in the organization. So I think because we're starting to be pulled into these organizations, we're challenging a lot of the way that these organizations are used to organizing. And that's where I'm seeing, I think, a lot of this change. And I think the delegation that we're sending this year as the U.S. Indigenous Youth Delegation, that's within an organization that I'm here, my name tag says, and that's Sustain Us. And if you knew us 5 years ago, I don't think you would have thought of us as an environmental justice organization versus a lot of just kind of white ivy lawyer, law-seeking people who are interested in like more going into policy and negotiations. But it's kind of really radically changed the more that we've brought in a more diverse group to really figure out how can we show up as youth. And we found our powers not to really sit and try to follow these negotiations and talk about how we can put things in brackets or add a comma somewhere. We've seen a lot more of the power in our ability to storytell. So that's usually the people we're bringing. So I think we're seeing those shifts. A lot of them are pretty recent too, though. So thank you.
Thank you, Owen, for the questions. And again, Michael, thank you.